So I've heard the argument that like test screenings can like really kill a film, and I think that to a level like putting I think when test screenings are like viewed by funders as like a make or break sort of moment, or all the feedback that you get from an audience is like everything that needs to be fixed, can't be helpful. But at the same time, like I think a test screening can be something that can like really change the course of a film. Like, I mean, the first one that comes to mind is Get Out, just because I know the change of the ending came from a test screening, and I think that was like a really good call, because part of making a film is not knowing how your audience is going to react to it. Like, you have intentions when you're making the film of, I want them to feel this and I want them to feel that. And if you're showing it to a group of people and you're getting a completely opposite response, or you're getting a response that you didn't think was going to come out, that might mean that even though your intentions are in the right place, it might mean that you are pointing it in the wrong direction. Because I also think that some, and now I'm not like talking about Jordan Peele specifically, but there are like lots of directors that have maybe like a little bit of like ego, and a little bit of thinking that they know exactly what is right and exactly the way that things are going to come out. And I think sometimes a test screening can be a little bit of like a hard wake-up call for not all perspectives are viewed the same as yours, and being able to think about, well, people who thought that this part didn't work, why did they think that it didn't work? And even if it's not making a change that was specifically asked for, sometimes it can lead you to a change that sort of encompasses that but also sticks to your original idea.
So yeah, I think that these things are always interesting conversations because they're kind of in the public eye now, and so people think that they're like new practices, but they're really not. Like, they've been around for a long time. It's like temp scoring too, that like people think temp scoring is a very new thing, but you know, Star Wars was entirely temp scored before Williams came on. So I think it depends on the context. I think that if it's a director or a creative team that are looking for feedback on something that they've done and they're like, I don't really know where to take this, I think that can be really valuable. I've been a part of a test screening, and it was for kind of like an indie sci-fi thriller kind of movie. And it was very helpful because I actually got to sit down and talk with the director and the DP and the producers afterwards and kind of go like, this is what worked for me and this is what didn't. And so they were very receptive to that, and they were very much open to listening to that. However, I think if it's a big studio, like, you know, it's the next Star Wars giant, and it's just a studio trying to look at how to please every single person in that audience, and they go like, well, that person was disappointed even though everyone else liked it, so how do we focus on that person so we get more people to come? I think that that's where it can get really damaging, because I've never believed in kind of like you know, one-size-fits-all filmmaking. I think that the best movies are movies that were intended for a certain audience that just wound up being so good that everybody can enjoy them. But I don't think that a movie that targets everybody, very rarely do I think that is a working kind of path to get to success. And I think a lot of studios, again, they're not really concerned about like the overall like technique or artistry of a film. They're interested in what's going to get the most people in seats. And I think that that's where test screenings can kind of be damaging, but also very helpful to a director who wants that feedback.
I think at its core, a test screening does need to be an open conversation. Oftentimes, there will be the larger projects that come in and are doing test screenings to troubleshoot a specific moment, rather than it being, okay, you're an audience, we need to see what an audience does. Like, the over scrutiny potentially ruins the objective perspective, or the subjective perspectives of those audience members, right? Like, the point of a test screening is it's supposed to replicate an early screening in some manner. And if you come in with a question of like, well, what did you think about Bleep Bloop's hair? Should it be green? Or like, it's the idea that like, you need to be flexible, you need to understand. And it does offer one great thing, is the fact that the filmmakers and the studio and everyone who's been involved in this process has been involved for maybe 2+ years, maybe more, maybe just a little less. But there's been a long process in which there's information that the filmmakers are taking for granted. There may be stuff that even everyone is like, oh yeah, I get that. That's his backstory because we've spoken about that element. But they've forgotten that is information they have through smaller conversations that perhaps they've now just internalized and realized that it's not on the screen for people to see. The importance of a test screening has to be the fact that it is an open screening for everyone. And with that, you need to realize that everyone's going to have a different opinion. And you need to realize, like, well, where's the middle ground from what I initially wanted to make and what's in front of us based on the information that the audience has just given me in this test screening.
Mm-hmm. I think you can also compare it to notes in a lot of ways. Like, if I send someone a movie and say, give me notes, oftentimes that person is looking for things to give notes on. They are, they're analyzing it under a microscope. And it's the same thing with test audience. Like, if you give a test audience a pamphlet and go, like, write down everything you don't like, then they're more likely to notice things that they don't like or point out things that they don't like than an audience that's just going in to see the movie would. So I think and that's not the audience's fault. That's often, it comes down to the way that you react to that. Like, I know that we all are kind of on the same page when it comes to notes, where it's like, I'll give you notes and I'll kind of go really hard on your movie. And then it's up to you to provide that context to yourself and go, like, oh, well, that's not something that anybody would care about if they weren't specifically looking for things to point out and note. And that you can kind of, it's more of a justification of the ideas than it is like taking every word that a test audience says or a note giver says as gospel and kind of changing your movie to suit their needs.
Well, and I think it is similar to when you're given notes, like, especially me, if I get a note that, like, I don't agree with, or even sometimes when I give, like, either of you notes, you'll say, like, oh, the note is more based on the fact that the way that it was explained it's not that there's an actual fundamental problem with the idea, but it's just the way that it's actually written on paper doesn't translate as much to someone who doesn't have all this, like, backstory. And particularly, like, when I make films, or I guess art in general, and that this definitely comes from, like, a theater background, to me the audience is part of it in a strange way. Like, to me it's not something, it's something that is meant to be something that is almost collaborative with an audience, including having negative reactions, but I don't totally discount, like, an audience reaction or like the general sort of view of movies, in the same way that I find that with theater. Like, when you're doing a theater piece, you're sort of doing it with the audience. They are like a part of it. They are like a living, breathing part of it. And I think a film can have a similar thing where even if your film is meant to be controversial, if your film is meant to have, like, create difficult dialogue, and you have a lot of people walking out of your test screening, arguing or getting into really difficult conversations, then if that was your intention, then you've accomplished it. But if that's not what's happening, I think it also, like, helps from the sort of, like, defensiveness of being wrong, because if you're given a note and you're able to explain it away or say, no, actually that doesn't make sense because of this, like you said, it's literally just reinforcing your point. You can only be more sure of the decision that you've made.
Yeah, and I mean, it's even on the opposite end of that too. Like, it comes down to, if you have a really stubborn filmmaker and every single person in a test screening said, like, we don't like this part, and he's like, that has to stay in because that's the point that I, like, made for my dog who passed away 6 years ago. People are like, it doesn't make sense. Then it can be a really good way for, the other creatives on that team to kind of go, like, see, like, nobody likes that part. You got to cut it.
You can't lose track of the initial intent of why you started telling that story, but you also have to realize that hopefully people are coming in from an open-ended perspective. And again, that is harder to manage because they've come in with the very intent to critique it. So there's a certain level of language you need to, like translation you need to do. But as long as what's being said by the test audience and you're able to sift through that and go, well, at least my initial intent is still, like, there, you can then jump off and try to fix elements that do not read, right? Like it is in turn, film is a language, and having people watch it and experience it differently is an opportunity for you to understand how you're using the language, and maybe you want to shift that, maybe you don't, sort of thing.